The winter of 1944 pressed itself against the world, like a hand determined to smother whatever warmth remained, and along the shattered edges of the Hurtgen forest, the war groaned with a kind of exhausted cruelty, as if even violence itself had grown tired of repeating the same tragedy over and over. Inside a makeshift German aid station, built from the bones of a collapsed farmhouse, lantern light flickered over cracked beams and blood-darkened stretchers, illuminating the figure of Oberfeldarzt Lukas Ehrlich, a medic whose hands moved with weary precision, even as his eyes betrayed a man strangled slowly by the weight of conflicting oaths. Snow hissed through the holes in the roof, like a whisper of ghosts, settling onto the floorboards and melting into tiny pools that mirrored the trembling light above. Outside, artillery rolled across the sky in distant waves, but inside, only the sharp scent of antiseptic and smoke lingered, clinging to the medic's coat like a second skin. Ehrlich had spent the early hours dragging wounded soldiers from the tree line, German and otherwise, because the forest offered no clear allegiance to any side and often spit out bodies without concern for uniform or badge. He was not a man who believed in the war any longer, though he had once carried its ideals like a torch before him, bright and naive, trusting that a nation could mold men into something purer. Years of watching boys die with the same questions on their lips had burned that illusion down to ash. Yet duty remained, the rigid spine of his existence, even as morality tugged at him like an insistent child. His hands continued their work partly out of discipline and partly because he feared what would become of him if he stopped, if he finally let the sorrow finish hollowing him out. When the German patrol burst through the door, carrying a wounded soldier on a stretcher made from branches and torn coats, Ehrlich's exhausted mind readied itself for another familiar task, but it was not one of theirs. The uniform was unmistakably American, sodden with blood at the abdomen, the fabric stiff where it had frozen on the march. The patrol's story came out in short bursts. They had found the man half buried in snow near a blown-out tree stump, breathing shallowly, whispering something in English that none of them could understand. They brought him not out of mercy, but because their commanding officer had demanded they bring back every wounded body they stumbled across. Prisoners were valuable, even the dying one. Ehrlich stared at the young man's ashen face and felt that familiar tightening in his chest, a constriction not born of fear, but from the unbearable recognition of human fragility. The American was no more than 20, and his eyes fluttered with the desperate, unconscious instinct to cling to life even when death had already drawn its first claims. The German soldiers shifted uneasily, unsure of what to do, some muttering that the medic should simply patch the boy enough to keep him from dying before interrogation. But Ehrlich felt the quiet shiver of his oath stirring beneath his ribs, the oath he had taken long before any flag had been hoisted in front of him. He knelt beside the American, and the cold of the floorboards crept through his knees, as though reminding him of the gravity of what he was about to do. With deliberate calm, he began removing the young man's coat, revealing the jagged entry wound just below the ribs, a wound that had torn deeper than it first appeared. He assessed it with a palm pressed gently against the feverish skin, feeling the tremors of pain rippling beneath. The German patrol watched with a mixture of irritation and confusion, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Ehrlich prepared the instrument slowly, knowing each movement was a declaration of his intention. He worked as he would on one of his own, clearing the wound, binding the torn flesh, whispering instructions to an unconscious boy who could not hear him. His hands shook only once, not from doubt, but from the enormity of the moment where compassion crossed into treason in the eyes of the regime he served. Snow continued to drift through the open beams, landing on the American's cheeks, like the softest benediction. The medic wrapped the bandages tighter, ensuring that if the boy survived the night, it would not be by accident. He felt the pull of conflict gnawing at him, the knowledge that saving this life might condemn his own. But he continued because there were rare moments when a man must choose what sort of story his name would eventually tell. By the time he finished, silence hung in the room like a fragile truce. The German soldiers exchanged looks they didn't want to voice, and Ehrlich stepped back from the stretcher with trembling breath, knowing the decision he had made would ripple outward until someone far above his rank demanded an accounting. Outside, the wind moaned through the broken farmhouse walls, as though mourning the inevitability of what would follow. But inside, there was only the small rise and fall of the American's chest, a fragile victory carved out of a collapsing world. If you're here and feeling the weight of this beginning, tell me in the comments where you're watching from before we continue the journey. Morning came reluctantly to the ruins, The light did not so much enter as seep in, filtering through cracks like a hesitant truth. The snow outside had thickened during the night, swallowing the battlefield into a pale silence that felt less like peace and more like the pause between breaths, an interval before the next inevitable collapse. Inside the aid station, Lucas Ehrlich sat slumped against a wall, the lantern long dead beside him, his gloves stiff with blood, his eyes refusing to close despite exhaustion grinding his bones into dust. The American soldier lay motionless on the stretcher near the door, wrapped in blankets scavenged from German casualties. The fever had not broken, but he still breathed, shallow but steady, as though life itself clung to him out of sheer obstinacy. Ehrlich watched that breath rise and fall, as if it contained the answer to something vast and unspoken. He had treated hundreds of soldiers, many of them enemies, but never under the gaze of his own men, who now watched him as though he had peeled away his own skin to reveal a stranger beneath. They whispered among themselves, their words barbed with accusation, and Ehrlich felt the weight of their silence more than their words. Compassion was a dangerous contagion here. It spread through whispers and glances, through the mere act of remembering that the man in front of you had once laughed, eaten, dreamed, just like you, and so they feared him now, not because of what he had done, but because of what his action forced them to see in themselves. The door burst open in the early hours with a gust of wind that carried in two officers, their coats powdered with snow, boots striking the floor with clipped authority. Oberstleutnant Weber, the senior of the two, wasted no time with pleasantries. His eyes scanned the room like a hawk measuring its territory, settling at last on the wounded American. He demanded an explanation, his voice hard as iron, his tone the practiced authority of a man who had long ago stopped asking himself whether orders were moral or not. Ehrlich rose slowly, every joint aching, and saluted with the dull reflex of habit. He explained that the man had been brought in by patrol, that he had treated him out of medical necessity, nothing more, nothing less. Weber listened, his face unreadable, but the other officer, younger and hungrier for approval, sneered openly. "Aiding the enemy," the younger one said, as if testing the phrase for taste. "You might as well have handed him your rifle." Ehrlich's answer was quiet, but it carried a calm that unsettled them. "He was dying," he said, "and I am a doctor. My duty does not end where yours begins." The words hung there, dangerous and alive, and the air seemed to tighten around them. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush breath from the lungs. Weber turned his gaze to the American again, studying the face of the unconscious man as if the answer might be written. At last, he ordered the medic to keep the prisoner alive until interrogation. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that the incident would be reported to command for review. Ehrlich knew what that meant. Command did not review, they punished. For the next days, he worked with the quiet precision of a condemned man. The war rumbled ever closer, artillery flashing at night like brief, furious constellations, and the forest trembled with the sound of dying machinery. The American began to recover slowly, drifting between delirium and silence. Once, in a fevered half-dream, he murmured something, "Mom," and Ehrlich felt a crack run through his composure. He pressed a cool cloth to the young man's brow and whispered in German, though he knew the boy could not understand. "You will live," he said softly. "You must." Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps a plea for absolution, though he no longer believed in either. Rumours began to slither through the ranks. Some said Ehrlich had betrayed the Reich, others that he was a coward, afraid to finish what war required. When the order finally arrived summoning him to headquarters, no one met his eyes. He packed what little he owned, his medical instruments, a small notebook of patients' names, and a photograph of his wife and son who had died in the Hamburg bombings 2 years prior. The photograph had faded from touch, the edges worn thin, but he kept it close, a fragment of the man he once had been. As he stepped out into the snow, he glanced back at the American one last time. The boy's eyes fluttered open, blue, unfocused, but alive. They met briefly, wordless recognition passing between them like a faint spark in the vast dark. Then Ehrlich turned away. The journey to headquarters was long and bitter. Each step through the snow was an argument between guilt and defiance. By the time he arrived, his breath was ragged, his heart heavy but resolute. He would tell the truth, and if the truth condemned him, so be it. When he was finally ushered before the tribunal, 3 officers sat beneath the black eagle of the Reich, their faces carved from marble and discipline. One began to read from a report, the accusation clear: aiding and abetting the enemy, dereliction of duty, violation of wartime protocol. Ehrlich listened without protest. When it came time for him to speak, He lifted his gaze and said only, "I did what any human should have done." For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was almost beautiful in its tension. Then the verdict came like the final stroke of a hammer. He would be court-martialed, his fate decided after formal review. Ehrlich bowed his head, not in submission, but in quiet acceptance. Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent as ever to the moral struggles of men. If this story has reached you so far, take a moment to subscribe. It helps this journey live on and reach others who still believe in humanity amid darkness. They confined him to a narrow cell carved from concrete and shadow, a place that seemed designed not only to punish the body, but to unmake the mind. The walls sweated with moisture from the cold, and the single window was no more than a slit near the ceiling where daylight entered weakly like a fading conscience. Lucas Ehrlich sat on the cot, back straight despite fatigue, his hands folded neatly on his knees. He had not been told what day the verdict would fall, nor whether he would live long enough to see the front collapse. The guards treated him with a detached contempt, sometimes spitting near his food, sometimes pretending not to hear his questions. But most often, they ignored him entirely, as though he were a ghost haunting the last corridors of a dying regime. He tried to keep his mind occupied by replaying the procedures of the wounded he had once saved, recalling each movement of his hands, each precise incision, each moment when life had wavered between departure and return. He imagined the American boy, alive, perhaps already repatriated, perhaps telling someone about the German doctor who refused to let him die. That thought alone was enough to keep his heart from calcifying completely. Yet even hope, when held too long in captivity, begins to corrode. Nights were the worst. The artillery thundered faintly in the distance, like a memory trying to claw its way back into the present. The Reich was breaking apart. He could feel it in the tremor of the floor, in the tension of the guards who smoked silently in the corridor, no longer speaking with conviction about victory. On the fifth night, the cell door opened without warning. A major entered, a man with weary eyes, his uniform immaculate, but his spirit fractured by years of service to an ideology that had long since devoured its believers. He studied Ehrlich for a moment before speaking. "You are a curious man, Doctor," he said quietly. "There are those who see in your actions treason, and others who see something inconveniently noble. Tell me, what did you gain by saving that boy?" Ehrlich lifted his gaze. "I did not save him to gain anything. He was dying, and I could not let him die." The Major exhaled a soft, almost sorrowful laugh. "You know, once I might have understood that, but these are not days for mercy. The law is clearer than conscience." "I imagine that's what everyone tells themselves," Ehrlich said. "That clarity is easier than guilt." The words seemed to unsettle the officer, who looked away as though the conversation itself had become dangerous. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "if I were you, I would prepare myself. The tribunal is not interested in truth, only in preserving what remains of its authority." Then he was gone, leaving behind a silence so deep that Ehrlich could hear the rhythm of his own heartbeat echo against the walls. Days blurred. Somewhere beyond those concrete boundaries, the world was collapsing. He heard rumors from guards, Allied troops crossing the Rhine, cities burning, soldiers deserting in droves. The certainty of the Reich's eternity had dissolved into ash, and yet the machinery of punishment continued to turn, as if cruelty needed no ideology to sustain itself. When at last they came for him, the air outside was sharp with cold. They led him through corridors lined with propaganda posters now peeling from damp walls, slogans that had once promised glory, now dissolving into mockery. The tribunal chamber awaited, a room of stone and echoes, lit by a single bulb that swung faintly from the ceiling, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. 3 officers sat behind a wooden table. The middle one, a colonel with thin lips and eyes that glinted like frost, opened the proceedings without ceremony. The accusations were repeated with mechanical precision, and Ehrlich listened in silence. When asked to confirm his actions, he did so without hesitation. "I treated a wounded man," he said. "He was the enemy, yes, but he was also human. My oath does not recognize nationality." The colonel leaned forward. "Your oath is to the Reich, Doctor, to the preservation of its soldiers, its ideals, its future." Ehrlich's voice did not waver. "Then perhaps that is why the Reich is dying, because it demands loyalty to itself, not to life." For a heartbeat, the room froze. The colonel's expression hardened into something between outrage and disbelief. "You dare lecture us," he hissed. "You, who would risk our cause for a single enemy life." Ehrlich met his gaze calmly. "Our cause is lost the moment we decide who deserves compassion and who does not." The silence that followed was suffocating. One of the younger officers shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening, as if the doctor's words had pierced something he had long tried to bury. But the colonel's verdict was swift and final. You will be court-martialed and sentenced for betrayal of duty. Your example must not infect others. They dragged Ehrlich from the room before he could reply. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent flakes, covering the footprints of soldiers who no longer believed in the future they were ordered to defend. He was taken to a holding area, a small wooden hut overlooking the forest, and told he would remain there until transport to the execution site. He did not ask when that would be. Instead, he sat by the narrow window, watching the snow settle on the branches, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to think not of war, but of the life he had lost. His wife Clara, laughing in their garden before the bombs came. His son, Emil, running barefoot through the grass. Those memories arrived not as pain, but as warmth, a final reminder that once, long ago, he'd belonged to something. That night, when the guards slept and the world outside hummed with the faint sound of retreating armies, Ehrlich whispered into the darkness, "I did what was right." The words were not defiance. They were confession, absolution, and farewell all at once. And though no one answered, the snow outside seemed to fall more gently, as if acknowledging the truth in its own wordless way. The front lines were shifting like a wounded animal trying to crawl away from its own pain. In the chaos of retreat, command structures disintegrated, loyalties blurred, and even the meaning of victory became unrecognizable. It was in this confusion that the young American soldier, Private Daniel Carter, opened his eyes fully for the first time since the forest. The room around him was unfamiliar, lit by pale sunlight leaking through torn curtains. His breath came ragged and shallow, each inhale tasting faintly of disinfectant and smoke. For a moment, he could not tell whether he was alive or trapped somewhere between. His vision swam, then steadied. The first thing he saw was the small tin cup on a nearby table and the faint steam curling from it. The second was the absence, the man who had been there in his dreams, the German doctor with eyes that spoke in silence. He remembered flashes, hands binding his wound, a voice he couldn't understand whispering something calm amid the thunder of artillery, then nothing. He tried to sit up, pain exploding through his side, like a reminder that mercy always comes at a price. A nurse entered, a Belgian woman working with the Americans who had liberated the nearby village. She smiled softly, told him he had been found barely alive in a captured German field station. He should have been dead, she said. Infection had set in, fever had burned through him, yet somehow he had survived. He asked, voice trembling, whether anyone had found the German doctor. The nurse hesitated, then shook her head. There were no doctors left when we arrived, she said, only bodies. But Daniel could not shake the feeling that the man still lived, somewhere beyond the walls of this fractured Europe. Each night, as he lay staring at the ceiling, he felt the weight of that anonymous compassion. It gnawed at him, not as guilt, but as responsibility. A stranger had crossed a forbidden line to save his life. How could he carry that without doing something in return? When he was strong enough to stand, he wrote a letter to his commanding officer, requesting permission to assist in identifying captured German medics. The request was unusual, perhaps even absurd in the eyes of men still fighting, but the officer, worn thin by war and haunted by his own share of ghosts, granted it. Meanwhile, somewhere deep in the collapsing heart of Germany, Lucas Ehrlich was being moved again. The court-martial's verdict had been signed, but no execution had been carried out yet. The Reich was crumbling too fast, its prisons overflowing with soldiers, deserters, and dissidents. Trains ran without destination, carrying the condemned to nowhere. Ehrlich sat in one such transport car, pressed between men who no longer spoke of politics or ideology, only of hunger, of wives they would never see again, of the absurdity that had devoured them all. Through the slats in the wood, he could see the landscape rushing by, a blur of snow, fields, ruins, churches stripped of their bells. Every village they passed through seemed emptier than the last, as if the war had not only killed people but memory itself. At one stop, the guards received new orders. The prisoners were to be transferred south to avoid advancing Allied forces. But as night fell and artillery echoed ever closer, confusion spread. One guard deserted, another was found drunk. The remaining soldiers argued, their discipline unraveling in the face of collapse. In the chaos, someone opened the car door, shouting for those who wished to live to run. Ehrlich hesitated. For years, He had followed orders, and now the lack of one felt like standing on the edge of the world. Then instinct, perhaps something divine, took over. He stepped into the snow and ran. The forest swallowed him whole, the darkness vast and absolute. He walked for hours, guided by starlight, and a memory of home that no longer existed. Hunger gnawed at him, but there was a strange serenity in the quiet, a feeling that whatever punishment he had been awaiting had already been served in the long silence of his conscience. When he finally collapsed beside a stream, the world had gone eerily still. No gunfire, no shouts, no commands, only wind moving through branches. He looked at his reflection in the water, unshaven, hollow-eyed, almost unrecognizable, and yet for the first time in years, he did not avert his gaze. In the weeks that followed, Allied patrols swept through the forests, rounding up stragglers. One such patrol, led by none other than Private Daniel Carter, now recovered but still limping, came across a figure huddled near the remains of a burned-out chapel. Carter raised his rifle, shouting for the man to stand and show his hands. The figure obeyed slowly, the gesture calm, almost resigned. As the light fell across his face, recognition hit like a jolt through Carter's chest. The eyes were the same, tired, infinitely sad, but undeniably human. He lowered his weapon before he realized he had done so. "It's you," he whispered. The German did not understand the words, but he recognized the tone, the tremor of gratitude. For a moment, the forest held its breath. Neither man moved. Then Carter stepped forward, lowering his rifle entirely. He motioned to his men to wait. "He's a medic," he said. "Don't shoot." The others looked uncertain, but obeyed. When Carter reached him, Ehrlich swayed, on the edge of collapse. The American caught him before he fell. "You saved me," Carter murmured, voice breaking. "Now it's my turn." The German, unable to follow the language, still seemed to understand the intention. He nodded weakly, eyes closing. By nightfall, Ehrlich was resting in the American camp, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and pine. Carter sat beside him, guarding his sleep like a sacred duty. Around them, the war continued to crumble into fragments. Pockets of resistance here, surrender there. But for one fleeting night, there was no enemy, no side, no cause left to serve. Only two men bound by an act of forbidden mercy, keeping one another alive in a world that had forgotten how. The war ended not with a roar, but with a long, exhausted sigh that seemed to drain the world of color. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins, cathedrals with broken spires, rivers choked with debris, towns whose names would never again mean home. In the American camp stationed near Aachen, soldiers gathered around radio, listening to the official announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender. Some cheered, some cried, most simply stared into the horizon with the hollow disbelief of men who had forgotten how to imagine a life without conflict. The air smelled of smoke, damp earth, and the strange sweetness of spring daring to return. Private Daniel Carter stood apart from the crowd, his hand resting on the sling of his rifle, though he no longer felt the weight of it as a weapon. The doctor, Lucas Ehrlich, sat near a fire some distance away, his face illuminated by the uncertain glow. Weeks had passed since they had found each other in the forest, and though communication was limited to gestures and halting words, they had formed an understanding deeper than language. Ehrlich's wounds had healed slowly. His body was thin, frail, but his eyes had regained a clarity that made Carter uneasy. It was the look of a man who knew he had no place left in the world he had survived. The US command had been notified of Ehrlich's presence. He was, by all technical, a prisoner of war, yet his situation confused the bureaucracy. The Americans did not quite know what to do with a man whose crime had been an act of mercy. He was neither guilty enough to execute, nor innocent enough to release. For now, he remained in the camp infirmary, assisting the medics, who treated both soldiers and civilians drifting through the wreckage of Germany. Carter often visited him, helping translate when others questioned him, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes only silence. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the canvas of the medical tent, Carter entered to find Ehrlich cleaning instruments with meticulous care. The doctor looked up, offering a faint smile that carried both gratitude and resignation. Carter sat opposite him and placed a folded letter on the table, a message from the War Crimes Commission. Ehrlich unfolded it slowly, reading what little he could understand. His name had been mentioned in several reports. His actions, saving an American soldier, refusing to obey direct orders, had reached Allied authorities. There would be an investigation, perhaps a hearing. Carter had already given his testimony, affirming that without Ehrlich's intervention, he would be dead. Whether that would save the man from punishment remained uncertain. "I told them what you did," Carter said quietly, "that you're the reason I'm still breathing." Ehrlich's eyes lifted, steady but unreadable. "War is a storm," he replied, his accent soft, his English careful. "When it ends, the rain does not ask who was right, it only falls." The words hung between them, simple and devastating. As the days passed, they became a strange fixture in the camp. The young American who had survived, and the German doctor who had defied his own army to save him. Some soldiers respected the bond, others mocked it, but no one could quite look at them without feeling the uncomfortable truth that decency had survived the war in ways the victors' slogans could not explain. One night, when a supply truck overturned on the muddy road, Ehrlich was the first to rush out into the rain, helping pull wounded men from the wreckage. No one stopped him. In that moment, the idea of sides dissolved entirely. There was only need, only humanity. The hearing took place a month later in what had once been a courthouse and was now little more than stone walls and makeshift desks. Ehrlich stood before an American officer and two Allied legal advisors. The questions were precise. Did you treat the wounded American, knowing he was the enemy? Were you aware that your orders forbade aiding Allied soldiers? Did you understand that such actions could be considered treason under the German military code? Ehrlich answered each with calm simplicity. Yes, yes, yes. And when asked why, he said, "Because I am a doctor. Because I could not become something less than human, simply to prove loyalty to madness." The officer leaned back, studying him for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "that kind of honesty can be dangerous, even now." Ehrlich smiled faintly. "Honesty has always been dangerous," he said. "That is why we hide behind uniform." The verdict was delayed. There was no precedent for a man like him. In the end, the tribunal ruled that Ehrlich would not be prosecuted as a war criminal. Instead, he was to remain under Allied supervision until further notice, aiding in the reconstruction efforts as a medical officer. It was not freedom, but it was life. When Carter heard the decision, he found the doctor sitting outside the tent, staring at the sky where the first birds of summer circled lazily over the ruin. "You're free," Carter said, though he knew the word meant something different now. Ehrlich turned his gaze toward him, a small, tired smile forming. "No one who has seen this war will ever be free," he said softly, "but perhaps we can learn to breathe again." In the weeks that followed, they parted ways. Carter was reassigned to assist in Berlin, and Ehrlich joined a relief unit traveling between refugee camps. Their goodbye was quiet, marked not by words, but by the simple human act of a handshake that lingered a moment too long. They had both carried death and had somehow, against all reason, delivered one another back to life. As Carter watched him disappear into the endless road lined with broken villages, he understood something unspoken, that history would never remember Lucas Ehrlich. The records would reduce him to a footnote, a name in a report, a man who disobeyed. But Carter would remember him not as a soldier, nor as an enemy, but as proof that even in the heart of darkness, one man's refusal to surrender his humanity could alter the course of another's soul. The years after the war were quieter only on the surface. Beneath that stillness, both men carried the slow thunder of memory, each heartbeat echoing with what they had done and what they had endured. Europe rebuilt itself in fragments, walls rising where there had once been ashes, laughter returning to streets that had forgotten its sound. But some ruins were invisible, built deep inside men who had seen too much. Lucas Ehrlich lived first in Munich, then in a small village near the Austrian border, working at a refugee clinic that treated the displaced, the orphaned, and the forgotten. He wore no uniform now, only a white coat that had been patched and repatched so many times it seemed to carry its own history of wounds. His hair turned grey, his hands thinner, but his manner remained calm, precise, almost tender. Each patient who came to him carried a story. A woman who had lost her family in Dresden, a child who had walked alone from Poland, an old soldier whose nightmares would not release him. Ehrlich listened to them all, but he never spoke of himself. There was no one left who knew his past. To his patients, he was merely Dr. Ehrlich, a man who worked tirelessly and asked nothing in return. But at night, when the lantern dimmed and the mountains fell into shadow, he sometimes heard the sound of that forest wind again, the snow hissing through broken beams, the heartbeat of the dying American, the whisper of his own defiance. He would sit by the window and write in a notebook no one would ever read, recording the small truths that history had no room for, that compassion was the only rebellion worth committing, that silence could wound deeper than shrapnel, that survival was both a gift and a sentence. Across the ocean, Daniel Carter tried to build a life in a country that had already moved on. He married a nurse he had met during recovery, bought a small house in Ohio, and worked as a teacher. On the surface, he lived the American dream: husband, father, veteran. But some nights, when thunder rolled across the fields, he would wake drenched in sweat, convinced he could still smell snow and blood, still hear the calm voice of the man who had saved him. He told no one. Even his wife, patient as she was, understood only fragments: the war, the wound, the shadow that seemed to follow him. Once, in the early 1950s, he received a letter from an international medical organization mentioning a German physician working with refugees in Bavaria. The name struck him like a chord from another life: Lucas Ehrlich. He thought of writing back. He even drafted a letter, 2 pages of careful English, where he tried to explain gratitude that words could not hold. He folded it, sealed it, and left it on his desk for a week. Then, one morning, he burned it in the fireplace, watching the paper curl into ash. Some things, he decided, were not meant to be reopened, yet the image of the man, his quiet resolve, the way he had looked at him before collapsing in that forest, stayed carved into the deepest part of his memory. Neither pain nor peace, simply truth. Years turned into decades. The war faded into books, films, commemorations, symbols easier to digest than the real thing. Ehrlich continued to work until his health began to fail. In 1961, he moved into a small apartment near Lake Constance. The clinic still sent for him occasionally when staff was short. He would walk the long path to the village square, leaning on his cane, greeting children who had no idea the old doctor had once been condemned by his own army for saving a life. He never sought redemption because he never believed he needed it. To him, redemption was a luxury reserved for those who had forgotten their sins. In 1963, a letter arrived, forwarded through the Red Cross. The handwriting was clumsy, but the message was clear. If you remember me, I want you to know I kept my promise. I lived. There was no signature, only an address in America. Ehrlich held the paper for a long time, his hands trembling, eyes filling with a quiet ache that was not quite sadness. He folded the letter, placed it inside his notebook, and wrote beneath it, "Mercy does not vanish. It only travels far." By then, Carter was an old man himself, his children grown, his wife gone. When he thought of the war, he no longer saw flags or maps, only a face framed by snow and lantern light, the face of the man who had refused to let the world make him cruel. Sometimes, he would walk to the edge of his yard at dusk and stare toward the east, as if he could feel the faint pulse of that same mercy carried on the wind across the ocean. They never saw each other again. They did not need to. Some bonds survive not through presence, but through the quiet certainty that somewhere another soul remembers. Time has a way of softening history until it fits neatly inside museums and textbooks, until the unbearable becomes a story one can tell without trembling. Yet some stories refuse to fade. They linger in the quiet corners, in unmarked graves and forgotten notebooks, in the whispers that pass between generations when the world grows too loud. The story of Lucas Ehrlich and Daniel Carter became one of those, half remembered, half invented, yet true in the ways that matter most. Ehrlich died in 1965 in his sleep, in that small apartment near the lake. The nurse who found him said he looked peaceful, as if he had just finished a long conversation with someone unseen. On his nightstand lay his notebook, open to the final page. The handwriting was faint but steady. "I chose to heal when I was told to harm. That is enough." The Red Cross contacted the only known correspondent in his records, a name written in English. Months later, the notebook was mailed across the ocean to an address in Ohio. Daniel Carter received it on a grey afternoon in autumn. He was 70 by then, his hands arthritic, his hair white as frost. The parcel was small, wrapped in brown paper, the handwriting on the label almost elegant in its simplicity. He opened it slowly, as though afraid to disturb whatever lay within. When he saw the name inside the cover, Lucas Ehrlich, Oberfeldarzt, 1940, he felt something tighten in his chest, a pulse of recognition so vivid it stole his breath. He turned the pages carefully, reading the fragments of a man's conscience, entries about patience, about war, about the unending struggle to remain human. There were no grand confessions, no pleas for forgiveness, only the steady rhythm of compassion written in ink that had begun to fade. At the back of the notebook, he found the letter he had written and never sent, preserved like a pressed leaf. Ehrlich must have received it after all. Beneath it, a single line in German, translated roughly as, "The life you lived is my answer." Carter sat for a long time at his kitchen table, the notebook open before him, the rain pattering softly against the window. He thought of the snow that had once fallen between them, of the firelight, of the silence that had said more than words ever could. He realized then that what Ehrlich had given him was not merely survival, it was the burden and beauty of conscience itself. In the years that followed, Carter began speaking publicly about the war, not as a hero, but as a witness. He told high school students and young soldiers about the German doctor who had saved him, about the moment he learned that mercy could be more revolutionary than victory. Some believed him, some did not. A few called it sentimentality, but he didn't care. He wasn't trying to convince anyone, only to leave a trace, however faint, of the truth that had shaped his life. When Carter passed away in 1972, his daughter found the notebook beside his bed, marked by decades of handling. On the inside cover, he had written a final note in his careful, trembling hand. If one enemy can save another, then perhaps we were never enemies at all. The notebook eventually found its way to a museum in Washington, placed in a small glass case among photographs of medics and prisoners, letters home, dog tags rusted with time. Visitors seldom paused before it. The label was brief, the names obscure. Yet for those who did stop, something about it lingered, the sense of two lives crossing in the heart of war and leaving behind a quiet defiance that no empire could erase. Outside the museum, seasons continued their endless turning. Snow fell, melted, fell again. Somewhere, beyond all borders and banners, the mercy of one man lived on, not as legend, but as proof that even in the darkest hour of humanity, a single act of compassion could still light the way home. And if this story reached you, let it stay with you, like a candle lit against the wind, like the memory of a choice that mattered. If you felt something in this journey, leave a like, share it, and subscribe, for remembrance, for reflection, and for the quiet courage of those who chose humanity when the world had forgotten how.